There we go.
I'll look it up, Simon.
Greetings in the love and in the light of the one infinite creator. Today we are here with Ivor and Simon Michaux, and we'll be discussing some topics on peak oil and the upcoming EU meeting Simon Michaux is having. Maybe he'll give us a brief overview of that, because it seems exciting.
There's a few of those. All right. Well, what do you want first? Okay. So I'm going into a high-profile panel discussion in a meeting at what's called the EIT. This is it's a raw materials innovation hub in Europe. They manage corporate investment that flows between government, industry, and academia. And so what they want to try and do is get me on stage. So it's a high-profile meeting. It's on the 16th. It's in Brussels. It's in a venue called The Egg, of all things. So you've got members in the audience. You've got lots of industry CEOs. You've got members of government now, like EU members of Parliament are in attendance. Members of the European Commission are in attendance. Members of the banking sector are in attendance. So there will be a discussion. There's about 4 or 5 of us on stage. Each one of us will present a slide based on what we think. And then after that, the slides stay up there and we all then have a discussion. And they're trying to get a discussion about the raw material requirements to phase out fossil fuels out in the open. The EIT has been looking at my work for a couple of years. And so far, groups like the IEA have not acknowledged that I even exist. Benchmark has not either. So on stage with me will be a member from the IEA, a member from Benchmark Minerals, the CEO of Arubis, which is a smelting company, the CEO of FMG, which is a mineral investment group, the Director General of the BGRM, which is the French Geological Survey, and I think there's one other guy who heads up a tech company. I can't remember his name. Anyway, so we all present our work one by one, then we sit down, we have a discussion. What the EIT are trying to get is a live back and forth discussion on people who do not agree. And so here's our data. Bounce, back and back and back. And so far I've handed my stuff in. We're supposed to have all our stuff handed to us like a week ahead of time. I've handed in my stuff, but I've yet to receive anything from anyone else. This will be the first time, as far as I can tell, that the IEA will have actually looked at my stuff directly and will comment. So that's next week, and there's a bit of prep going into that.
Wow, sounds really exciting. Yeah, so, and will there be a video or anything?
Unknown, probably. There'll certainly be journalists in attendance. I see this as a polite bar fight.
Okay. You called it a cage fight.
Yeah, that's the other phrase I've used. It's a cage fight, because we've got several very different opinions going in there, and so in theory there'll be a meeting of minds. Here's my data. Here's why. So there is discussion around 2 points. One is the size of the buffer needed for wind and solar, right? And that is actually the sore point. That is everyone's sort of tearing up the landscape on Twitter over. And the other one is, if we did have to actually produce such a lot of buffer, why don't we just use pumped hydro? So there's answers to both of those.
Yeah. Well, they're doing a pumped hydro near where I live now. Mm-hmm. So did you want to briefly just say why or why not?
Okay. So the U.S. Department of Energy picked up on my work a couple of years ago. They found it was at cross purposes with their own work in a very, very big way. Their work did not include any minerals at all, any sort of mineral thing at all. It was just treated as a market thing, as per what Princeton University suggested they should do. Now, normally that'd be fine, but the Princeton University study had missed a fairly major thing. But as it turns out, everyone else did too. So what they do is there's the managing between supply and demand. sometimes demand exceeds supply. Sometimes it's above, sometimes it's below. When it exceeds supply, they need to capture that, store it, and then a couple of days later, when there's a shortfall, they can release it. And they generally only need to keep it for a couple of days. So they did a couple of studies that went back over, say, 40 or 50 years of data, and they're looking at the day-to-day differences. And that's all they did. They did not look at the long-term variations between, say, winter and summer. In winter, the sun is less strong than in summer. It's not rocket science. It's something we all know. But the reason they missed this is all power systems at the moment are balanced off each other, and they trade power between them, and that's how they operate. And we do that because they're fossil fuel based, oil, gas, and coal. Gas in particular can be run at any time, on, off, up, down, whatever you want. Take gas and coal and oil away, we can't balance those systems anymore. So the systems have to be internally self-sufficient. You can't balance wind and solar off against other wind and solar because they're both variable at the same time for the same reasons. When you have less sun, because it's winter, it's actually winter all over that hemisphere. Right, so even countries like in Spain, for example, the difference between summer and winter is strong enough to need a 16.2 day. Like Ewan Mearns did a study where we actually looked at the difference in June and November for a concentrated solar platform in Spain, and he found that to keep things balanced in November you needed 16.2 days of buffer. So, ouch.
Yeah. So if say you had like a 1 megawatt station, then how much buffer would you need?
So it comes down
like
to
how many megawatts in the holding facility? I mean,
Okay, so they had like a 670 megawatt facility, but you need more than a gigawatt of storage to do it because 670 megawatts as running. It came down to the time, like how much time do you need to do it? Like, so Princeton University came out with 5 to 7 hours, and that's all that was needed. But you're not going to balance winter with summer with 5 to 7 hours, and this is the debate. So I picked up on a reference, and they said 28 days, and I looked at the actual thing that's way too low. The Department of Energy came back and did this study internally, and they said, look, we're probably looking at, that they did a study across the year of 2022, and they found that wind and solar did underperform for about 4 months of the year. Right, so how much buffer you would need to get through that, I don't know. The study didn't come out that, and and so conceptually, 5 to 7 hours ain't going to cut it, not even close. So there is a problem there. It has been completely missed by all developers of power systems so far because the way we operate now is with fossil fuels. How we are going to be forced to operate in the future has never happened before, right? And so that basic thing there, they just completely missed. And there's no shame in that. This is such a goddamn complicated problem, right? But once pointed out, now we must look at it. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of say there. And so just at 28 days, which is an estimate, I actually think it might be as much as 2 or 3 months. But that suggests that wind and solar in their current form are actually not a viable replacement the way we think they are. And that is the primary energy source for the IEA going forward. 70% of the grid will be wind and solar. Right? And if we knock out fossil fuels, that's where we're going to get our energy from. That's where our industry is going to be based in. So,
what about the energy return on investment? Because I've heard conflicting reports, but I thought that wind and solar simply don't have a high enough EROI.
No. So that's correct, right? Now, but here's where the shit gets real. There is no agreement in the literature over energy return on energy invested in terms of what should be in the calculation. And there's been a couple of papers that have come out that have refuted everyone else, which have come out with these wildly high values of energy return on energy invested for all renewables. And I don't understand how they do their calculation. So I'm actually part of a group now that's doing a study that's going to try and get to the bottom of that. How do you compare apples with apples between, say, solar and coal. How do you actually sort of compare between the two of them? Because they're such different things, right? And so what we're now going to try and do is take it back to the mining of the raw materials to make the equipment for everything involved. For the coal-fired power station, right, and then the coal itself, and then all the machines that mine the coal. And we're going to do the same thing for solar panels. Where do they come from? How are they manufactured? What energy went into that? What was the energy that was embedded into the metals required to make the solar panels? All the way back to the mining of those minerals and the equipment needed to mine those minerals. So there's a lot of work in there, and it's quite complex. So I'm actually collaborating now with a couple of other people, and we're going to try and get to the bottom of that. I didn't use energy return and energy invested in my calculations, right? I did this straight. We now must have a certain amount of power delivered to the grid. We used to do it with coal, knock coal out. Now we're going to do it with wind and solar. So then I went to the Global Energy Observatory and says, right, in the year 2018, across that calendar year, what was the performance of individual power stations across all energy systems? And I collected about, say, 10,000, I suppose, that they had available. And so I had enough to actually run some statistics, like what was the average coal-fired power station? How much power did it deliver? What was its availability? Like it was available like 90% of the time, is what coal is. Then you get to solar, right? And so you had your different systems, and how big was the average one? How many solar panels? How many installed megawatts? Okay, so how much power was that system able to deliver over a calendar year? And it turns out solar was only operating about 11.4% of the time, right? And that's you can't do anything about that because it's subject to the weather, and also the moment the sun goes down, it's all over, right? So, and then when you get to winter, it underperforms. So and that's just the nature of solar, right? So I'm not bagging solar. I'm saying this is what we have to actually work with. And if we knock out oil, gas, and coal, what are your options, guys? Right, and it's just that we need to actually sort of settle ourselves in, and so now I've been talking to Nafis Ant, and he's come up. He has proposed the idea of overbuild. So if we build 3 times the needed volume, and so we would need less buffer. And so I'm trying to sort of get my arms around it. How would I describe that in my scenarios? Yeah, and so I didn't. Energy return, energy invested is such a blunt tool, but in general, fossil fuels are much, much better in what they deliver than what renewables are. But it doesn't capture complexity. Like the complexity behind the conventional nuclear industry is amazing. It's humongous. So nuclear is our best performer, right? But there are serious limitations of what we can do because of the complexity limitations.
I was gonna ask about the pumped hydro. They had one they've had one probably for 50 or 60 years in New York State, the Blenheim Gilboa power station. I've been there, and they basically, it's just nice and simple. You just pump water up into that reservoir, and then when you need it, you run it out.
Right.
I don't know how
so
long
pumped
that will
hydro
last.
is the best and cheapest way to store power. And that's 98% of power storage at the moment happens in pumped hydro. That's just a simple, straightforward thing. We need something like, and this is an estimate which I think is actually on the low side, we need something like 2,192 terawatt hours a year of pump storage. Now, let's say we've got an example where you've got two dams and it can go back and forth, and you can store 24 gigawatt hours of energy, of electrical power generation. That's a pretty big system, right? But if we were to do that, we would need 93,000 such sites, right?
Wow. And can you give an estimate of what is the size of one of these 24 gigawatt stations? How many acres or square kilometers?
250 hectares. Like a 250 hectare pond that it can pump between the two of them. Then you got the problem is the energy that you put to pump up that hill has got to be taken out of the actual energy stored, right? And I've yet to actually sort of go down the rabbit hole on that. And there is a reasonable ratio there, but it does cost. And so we've got to sort of establish that. So now, a couple of years ago, because pumped hydro is the thing, all policymakers at the moment think all future power storage is batteries. They have no fucking idea about the quantities involved. They still think they only need 4 or 5 hours capacity. They think batteries are the thing because they're simpler. You don't have to rezone stuff. You don't have to build massive things like the spinning flywheels or compressed air storage. Yeah, batteries are simple. They're cheap, apparently. They can be installed in any capacity, any size, any footprint, in any weather. They're not restricted by any sort of weather conditions. And so policymakers around the world believe the future of power storage is batteries, which is why I did what I did. I did start to actually look at pumped hydro, because there's a few studies around that look at, well, we've got, in Australia alone, there's like 6,000 possible sites that you could do pumped hydro in of various different sizes.
Oh,
and so, right, well, yeah.
Just since you were on the topic of batteries and all of these fabulous ideas, can you just briefly, to those viewers who are not familiar with all of the limitations?
Right. Okay.
Right.
So the pumped the storage power stationary power storage needed to smooth out wind and solar across the calendar year, assuming the 28-day buffer, which I think is too small, right, is about 30 times the size of the battery capacity needed for the electric vehicle fleet, with the assumption that all heavy vehicles are hydrogen fuel cells. Right, so we need a lot of batteries.
Right.
At the moment, all our policymakers are insisting that the future is lithium-ion chemistry. There are other chemistries. You can make batteries out of sodium, out of fluoride, out of zinc, out of silica, but our policymakers will not take them seriously. No. Wake us up when it's more economic. And so it was really bad a couple of years ago. It's improved since then, but you could not even have a discussion in public, like in a conference, for example, about alternative battery chemistry. You just weren't taken seriously, thrown out of the room in some cases. But all attempts to get funding for scale-up for large operations, they insist on lithium-ion chemistry, which is a problem because my work is showing that we just don't have the lithium in the ground. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, vanadium, and even graphite all have problems, supply problems. And so the mining industry at the moment is not in a fit state to expand several thousand%, which is what's required. And we're not prepared for the environmental costs of an expansion like that. We just haven't thought it through, right? So, but if we actually took the time to make batteries out of something else, those something else things don't have those resource constraints, right? And so you can, and a lot of the time they're found in our industrial waste. The fluoride in your toothpaste is actually a waste product in a lot of industry stuff, and they don't know what to do with it. Turn it into batteries, guys. But you've got to develop the value chain to do it. You can't just magic it up overnight.
Yes, so it would take a lot of research time. So one of the things that I like to look at it is like, what are the proven technologies and what are the most probable trajectories given, the oil decline right now or the energy decline and our current production facilities and our current, what we have. And then we just kind of project a most probable 10 to 20 years. And then I was thinking, hydroelectric, sustainable wood. I don't know if there's much else to it, and then kind of like, what is the world?
So we've got another number of problems here, and most of them are in the place where the eye does not see. Right. So for a start, our current manufacturing system, the first bottleneck we hit, the first one we hit is going to be available capital at a time when our money system is crashing. Right. And our second thing we're going to hit is our oil systems that are dependent on oil in particular are becoming unstable. Peak oil does look like November 2018, like the crude oil component. We're not talking total liquids, crude oil. Right. So at the moment, most manufacturing is done in Southeast Asia, China in particular. Like solar panels, all solar panels are made in China. Or rather, one of the components is made in one province in China, and 15% of a particular component in particular comes through one factory.
Wow.
And so in Europe, for example, we just don't. We manufacture some things here, but they're always on components made from Southeast Asia. We're not even making our own components, and we're certainly not doing our own mining and smelting. That's all someone else's problem. And so the people who control the money believe there is no problem. We don't need to be self-sufficient. Chinese money is just as good as European. Go away, right? And so we're seeing very clear differences in that. So our first thing is that it says our ability to manufacture stuff is seriously lacking, and that's when we cooperate. If we're going to go into a shooting war with the very countries that we are now dependent on raw materials, Russia and China, they're probably not going to do business with us. Sorry, but that's the reality.
Yeah. I was noticing this kind of pattern in the geopolitics is that U.S. seems to try to start stuff with countries that have like oil, but it always ends very badly. Like when they invaded Iraq for their oil, but it didn't work because they just blew up their oil rigs and now they can't pump them out anymore. And now what they're doing with Russia, because Russia has the last shale field. And so my hypothesis anyways, that maybe part of this proxy war is they want Russia to fall apart and then they can go in and develop that shale field. But I don't know if it's not going to work well without the cooperation. Like you say, I think that cooperation and working together is going to yield much better outcomes.
So I'm going to share with you, if I may.
I'm just going to say, just remember that all wars are for God. That's gold, oil, or drugs.
You're actually correct there. So I'm going to share my screen on a map that I actually released in my 2019 oil report. So what I've got here is two columns, right? So on the right-hand column, we've got the countries that have gone to war with other countries. And on the left-hand column, it's where they've gone to war. Now, both sides of this thing here have oil reserves, right? So this explains the last 39 years of war, with the exception of the war in Libya in 2011. I think that's the only one that's missing. So anyway, but everything else is here: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait. And so economic sanctions, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, they've all got oil. But the countries going after them are the West, and they're all in partnership. The United States, Saudi Arabia. Iraq was a United States ally until 1991, and then they became the enemy. Canada, European Union, United Kingdom. Right, so the recipients have 44% of reserves, but the aggressors have 36 or 37%. But they also have a lot of the production and as well. You put those two sides together, it represents 77.9% of reserves, 64% of production, and 48% of consumption. I believe this is who controls the oil industry as we approach peak oil. You might notice that since 2018, there's been less wars about oil as such.
Yeah. So, well, we're past peak oil, and
oh yeah, well that's I believe that is correct. Yeah, but it's like who controlled the oil industry 20 years before peak oil, and that's what all the fighting was about. And so both the aggressors and the recipients had oil reserves. So it wasn't just a clear-cut case, you got the oil, we want it. No, we want to control your oil.
Right.
It's got to be done on our terms.
I wanted to speak a little to Ivor's comment there about war being for God, but at least in the Confederation of Planets view, God is for peace and love and kindness, and it is the demonic entities that want people to have war and wage war with each other. And their recommendation, or the Confederation of Planets recommendation, is to like the best way we can do the transition is if we all work together and share, and then it might be difficult, but we'll be able to pull through by being kind to each other and our citizens, rather than shoving them in a meat grinder or other things which are happening now.
Yeah, and so I believe humanity has been put into a very desperate situation now, where we're going to have food shortages and energy shortages and all sorts of problems. And a lot of it didn't have to be that way. It's been made to be that way. But what it does mean is, instead of actually sort of talking amongst ourselves civilly, we're going to go to war with each other because we don't have enough to eat. And I think the people that control our society would prefer that, because they can control the outcome on their terms. So,
yeah. And historically, we know that this is definitely a pattern that like they found based on when the heart. I think it was like a slight cooling or whatever, and there would be a less food production, and then often that would there would be wars right after that, or purges, or like the various holocausts of Jews and whatever. And then, like in China, for instance, that they had went to war for food, but then the war itself, I think 75,000 people died or whatever, but it destroyed the infrastructure to allow the agriculture, and then that killed millions. So war is really bad for everybody. So I think it would be good to, I don't
it
know,
makes money
if
for a small number of people.
yes.
It's about concentrating power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so exactly. So it's those people at the top who are kind of in that fear, anger, control mode who are gaining most of the benefit. And by having that's why one of the reasons I'm promoting the distributism of kind of more people with land to grow their own food and firewood, as I see it as one of the most viable transition strategies. And then just by having more people who are kind enough to each other to allow each other to have the resources to sustain themselves, we can eventually just kind of ignore the people who are like, no, let's have war, and that are trying to shove people in meat grinders. So I don't know, what's your take on that? Do you think it's possible to have a more kind of a localized distributist movement? Are there any governments that might be interested in being nice to their citizens or anything in Europe or otherwise?
The politics of it, like, I'd make a lousy politician. I'd have to be nice to digits, right? So I'm not the politics guy, right? But I would say, excuse me, I would say that regardless of whether governments want to be nice to their citizens or not, the dynamics of energy density will force a particular outcome, I believe. Now, if the old systems thing, like, energy in dictates its complexity and size of a system. Reduce the energy, the system has to become simpler, decentralize. Right. So if we're moving into a low energy future, then the large clusters of human population will have to break up. And what that will look like, I think, is instead of actually having, say, the British Isles, for example, is administered at the moment from London in a federal government. All the authority, all the laws, and everyone is to say yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. I can see a situation where that federal government won't break up as such, but it'll become less relevant. The authority will transfer to the shire and local council, right? And so the decisions of what actually gets done and why will happen at a more local level, on a smaller level. So the central government, its role will change. It'll be something like information transfer, or communication. It will not be dictating terms to everyone else. And that's something that probably scares the hell out of them. Now, that idea was validated when I read the World Economic Forum Great Reset stuff. They, in Agenda 21, well, no, it's now Agenda 2030, they are explicitly wanting a relationship between a global entity and every single local shire council directly. Right, and so information transfer systems are sophisticated enough to allow for that. So I think that global term wants to dictate things directly to shire councils.
And is a shire council like a county council?
Oh
Or is
yeah,
it
county, like a small area, a county,
okay.
like a region. Yeah, the city
Right.
council around a small city, like the mayor of a particular city. A larger city, like instead of having 12 million people, I can't see how 12 million people can now stay in a concentrated form without some kind of concentrated energy source. Right. And so if we're going to go to solar panels and wind turbines, then we're going to have to spread out.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was thinking, in terms of that, having that kind of maintaining a global system while also having rural. So if you have these villages of, say, like 200 acres for 60 people or whatever, and then, oh well, those would be like the churches, and then you have the rural blocks, and that makes a village of 300 to 400 or 500 people, and then you
Do
have,
we have the arable land for that? Is there enough
well,
arable land on the planet for all that?
it's just that you can't do it with arable land. You have to use permaculture. You have to grow, basically in like desert regions. You would need to grow cactus, pear, or dragon fruit, or ice cream beans, and mimosa, or whatever will grow there.
Okay. So
And
wouldn't it
then
take years to set up?
it would take years, but we still have some years right now if we get started. But yeah, it's unlikely we won't be able to transition everybody. Well, on multiple factors. One, the major one, is that most people don't want to. But
Yeah.
if we give the opportunity for at least some people, then we will be able to at least have these starter seeds. Like, one of the analogies I like to give is, it's kind of like a dandelion, and our civilization has gotten past the flower stage, and now it's in the seed forming stage, and then eventually it's going to kind of like blow out and then the new dandelions will form, or whatever. And so I think that right now we need to focus on making those seeds for the civilization that will come afterwards.
Can I say
So-
something?
Yeah.
Elliot Tolman, who's a famous local organic gardener here in Maine, I one time called him up on the radio and I said, is there going to be enough? Is it going to be more productive? And he said, actually, organic agriculture, like the type that he does with, little greenhouses and things, is far more productive per acre than modern agriculture. But it takes a lot more work and it takes a lot more to set up. So, I mean, this is the thing, is you have to plan way ahead and you have to get the a lot more nutrients into the soil pretty soon to make it actually work. So that he does say it is definitely more productive per acre than what we're doing now.
Well, that I think that would be one of the more intensive strategies, like the greenhouse production. You can certainly produce more, but I don't think it's sustainable, because you're going to need plastics and you're going to need pumps, and that's all coming from China. And so the most sustainable is having the trees and the shrubs, because they are self-replicating, and then, like, once they're set up, they usually go pretty well. Like in tropical areas, you can set up a food forest in about a year to a year and a half, and then because, like, say, papaya will produce in 11 months. And but you have to, as you go to more temperate areas, that interval increases, and by the time you're in the Arctic, it could be like 20 years for your pine nuts to go. But
I had a food forest, remember, for over 20 years. Produced maple syrup, and we also produced the heat for our house, and a number of other things, shiitake mushrooms, and maybe some ginseng, things like that. So we basically did that. And it does take the problem is you have to find, for us, we searched for 4 or 5 years to find a lot with enough big trees on it so that you could produce maple syrup. So they're not, you have to, they take 45, 50 years to get big enough. So we got troubles. We've got to recreate that world where people make some of their own food.
Yeah. So Simon, I was thinking that in order to kind of integrate these two systems where there's still global coordination, so if say the churches elect their leader, and then the village elects their leader, and then all the villages and the county or whatever elect their leader, and then like amongst the county, anyways, you can go all the way up to the global, and then you can have like a global democracy. I don't know if that's in the plans, or if they want a more authoritarian, or what do you think?
Well, all these things are easy to say. There's seriously practical headwinds in all of it. I'm surrounded by the vast majority of people who just don't want to know about any of this, right? And when they want to talk solutions, they're talking about solutions that aren't practical.
Yeah. I've experienced that as well. Though I know thanks to your talks and John Peach and others, people are waking up to the fact that we don't have enough minerals for renewables. Peak oil is real. So there is improvement in that regard. I don't know if you're seeing anything like that.
When I had some work colleagues when I was writing the oil report, I was taken to task. I was taken out to the woodshed for, I said, peak oil, I've heard peak oil said so many times. This is in like 2019 when I was writing the report, right? So many times. First it was 2005 and nothing happened. And then it was 2010 and nothing happened. And I'm so many predictions, and yet every single one of those dates have a peak oil relevant signature that they don't actually understand what it really means. And so the very same people who were saying, don't you dare say the word peak oil in a report, even though it was the first time in years, they said, it's been said so many times, it'll be debunked. We are now 4.5 years on the other side of a localized peak oil that's looking like the real thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And those very same people are trying to say, that's been accepted. That's old news. Peak oil's come and gone and nothing happened. And I'll go, fuck me.
I like to explain to people that it was peak reserves that was in the 70s, and then peak conventional in 2004, and then peak, I guess, unconventional in 2018.
Yeah, but that unconventional, like the entire US reserves, represent 3% of global oil reserves, or at least it did in 2019. 3%. So the US tight oil sector is now holding the entire system up. It's up in the air, right? And they're holding the entire world up. All new growth has come from the tight oil sector since 2005. Or 2008, I think it is.
Wow. Yeah.
96%. That's okay, right? So the entire sector is now held up in a really, really inefficient method that requires a lot of drilling, and it represents a few very small percent of the whole world reserves, and you guys are holding the entire system as the swing producers. That it has got to be a very temporary situation.
Yeah, I know John Peach, he showed some graphs where he did some kind of Gaussian addition of all of the curves, and like the Gawar one, it has a very slow taper, but the he says that shale, and I've talked to other shale people, and they confirm that after 3 years there's an 80% decline. And so he believes that it could be a very, very steep decline now that we've reached or seem to have reached peak shale in the US. So in the next 3 to 6 years.
There's other things going on there. For example, you've got to keep drilling up. You've got to keep drilling to keep to because I think it's about there's a 90% drop in production across 18 months. I think they were the figures I was told. I think that is the case. I'm not sure if it's the same for all shale operations, but it is something like that. Whether it's 18 months or 3 years, it doesn't matter, right? So, but you've got to constantly keep drilling and then refracking and doing stuff, and so, but that costs money. And if you're not going to put the upfront capital investment to keep that drilling up, then production will drop off. And so what I think's happened with the tight oil sector is not so much they've run out of oil, although at some point they will, but they've run out of money, upfront capital investment to do the upfront drilling and keep the production going. They've dropped the ball on that, which means they've built in an inefficiency that's coming.
And is that because they're losing so much money? Like I read they lost $300 to $500 billion on shale oil so far.
So they've been losing a lot of money on it, but they're putting a lot of money in because the shale oil system is keeping the petrodollar system alive, and the petrodollar system can just print more money for its own survival, right? And so the whole thing just keeps on expanding. I think there's a number of things going wrong for them, right? And one of them is the flow of capital that they normally put into shale oil is now being directed elsewhere. It's very hard to get capital, for example, to mining investment. Now, copper. No one wants to invest in copper mines because mining used to be the greatest medium risk, high return game in town, right? But now, to open a mine in, say, South America, you've got to spend something like $4 billion before you build all the infrastructure. So then you've actually got to start producing, and then you've got to spend an extended period of time to produce to pay off that $4 billion in capex. That could take 10 years, right? And so they could put money into a copper mine, and maybe they'll get their money back in 10 years. Maybe they won't. Or they can put the money in the stock market, get the same result in 6 weeks.
Right.
But and so we don't care about you. See ya.
I heard, isn't like the stock market like going down recently?
So that's the other side of things. I actually don't look at the stock market anymore. I leave it to others to do, banking assessments because the numbers are so cooked. The whole system is so cooked. I like Catherine Austin Fitz, and Lynette Zhang's another one I like to look at to explain, how things are going. Chris Martinson also. So I just look at those guys, and when they come up with something, we've got a problem. Oh, the other guy I like is an Australian guy. What's his name? I'm trying to remember it.
So what are they saying from what you've heard them?
They're all saying that we are the system has actually been coming apart at the seams for some time now.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it's not a temporary thing. It's actually been happening for years, and they just happen to be, talking it up. But the data that sits behind everything, China, for example, there's a number of podcasts I watch for China. For the last couple of years, the first clear thing you could have seen was the Evergrande commercial real estate disaster, right? That unfolded and has unwound, and now the Chinese economy has some very, 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 very serious problems undermining in their real economy, right? But they're doing it. It's fine. It's fine.
So can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Right. So China Uncensored is the one I like for them, right? So Evergrande was a real estate investment program that actually inside China, they had a portfolio of 54 trillion US in their real estate portfolio, right? And their stock market price crashed 96%, right? And so you had that amount of capital all of a sudden became worthless in the period of,
$54 trillion.
Yeah. So,
wow.
so the Chinese have a lot of stuff happening internally that happen on a scale that far exceeds a lot of Western actions because their population is so much larger. Now, the Chinese company system, when things were going well, was in thirds. 1/3 of businesses were doing reasonably well. 1/3 were on the breadline, like they're about to go under, and 1/3 were actually insolvent and were being eaten by the other 2/3. And there was a very, very tense and intense competition about which third your company happened to be in. So when the Chinese companies present as a united front when they come outside China, inside there is the most brutal competition you've ever seen. So the companies that actually survive that, when they sort of come out, and they come up against Western companies, but they're backed by the People's Republic of China government and the vertically integrated industrial system, and they're sharks. And so most Western companies are just not prepared for that kind of competition. But internally in China, they've got a lot of there's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of industrial orders that just aren't coming in from outside China, but also within China. A lot of their industry has ground to a halt. They have a lot of components that just aren't not manufactured anymore. And the COVID lockdowns that they actually did, when their approach to all that has destroyed a lot of their real economy, and their people have had enough. They've just had enough. Now, there's a lot of civil unrest in China that we never hear about. I met a chap at a conference who was Russian, who was living in the Siberian region close to the Chinese border, and he was saying a lot of the information coming out of Russia was ridiculously cooked as well. But in China, they had a phenomenal number of civil unrests across the territory of China on a daily basis. And so they're constantly trying to keep a lid on this. And that's when things were going reasonably well. Now we've got a point where we've got massive amounts of unemployment. They've got energy problems. They've got food problems, getting food around. Their system was very much damaged by the COVID lockdowns, but underneath that, there was a lot of real economic problems as well. Like a lot of the Chinese system was a Ponzi scheme, much like the United States is a Ponzi scheme. And as long as no one says it out loud, it's okay. But the moment if the moment someone calls shenanigans and the spotlight is put on the real situation, then communication starts to happen in a way where we've got a problem. So that's happening in China. That is also happening in a lot of the finance systems across the planet. Now, we're not hearing about it in mainstream news, right? But there's a lot of, like in Australia, for example, the banking sector is in a lot of trouble. And they're now actually considering things like shutting down the credit line of certain members of the Australian banking community. They're not shutting everyone's credit card down, but some of them.
What?
So you rock up to the grocery store, and you're going to pay your groceries, hand over your credit card, thinking you're going to use it, and the purchase is declined.
And is this because they're running out of funds in Australia, or?
So the Australian banking system is attached to the rest of the world. They're actually owned by the US banking system. The Australians have the highest ratio of debt to the ability to pay that debt off in the Western world at the moment. In 2008, all the Western countries, Ireland was at the very top, right? They had something like 1,000% debt to GDP, so something silly like that. And so there was a widespread problem, a widespread economic fallout associated with that. And then we had the global financial crisis. Australia now has the Irish position going into that, right? So the Australians have taken an enormous amount of debt. The housing market on one, like a lot of money is leaving. It's trying to leave other sectors, and it's trying to go into real estate, because if you can actually buy something tangible, if you can take your funny money currency and turn it into a piece of land, that piece of land will still be there, and you'll still have the deed when everything crashes. That's the idea, right? And so they're trying to actually sort of, and that's what's been holding the real estate market up. All this foreign investments flowing in everywhere, but now all over the world, that's now dried up. Real estate, commercial real estate in particular, is drying up. And so there's a lot of major retailers in the United States that are shutting down. A lot of the political shenanigans that have happened over the last couple of years, that some things like the Black Lives Matter strategy. You've now got in the regions where all that happened, retailers just packing up and leaving. Crime's just going through the roof, right? And so,
yeah, because they keep getting robbed, right? And then
well, they can't do any business, they can't hold any stock. Yes, they keep getting robbed. The staff keep getting assaulted, which they're then liable for, and their shops are being vandalized, and the police are being, what's left of them now that they've been defunded, or the defund the police movement demoralized the police force. So anyone who was any good just left. They just quit their job and left. And so the police you have left behind are the people who couldn't leave, and they're not necessarily the best police officers. But and so to be a police officer in that environment where you have so few resources, you no longer have the trust of the community, and you no longer have the trust of your own political infrastructure, right? But crime is exploding. It's a self-reinforcing. It's a negative reinforcement.
Yeah, go ahead, Ivor. I was going to ask because you're in the U.S.
I lived in New York City in the 80s, so I know what it's all about. I mean, the place was falling apart bad back then. But what I'm saying is, San Francisco. I was in San Francisco, and it's not a cakewalk either. I think what's happening is those inner cities are starting to decay again. I mean, for a while, okay, everybody wanted to move back to the cities and be there, and now I know, you go into a place like Philadelphia, and as you go in on the train in Baltimore, 2/3 of the city is like abandoned. It's like the South Bronx used to be in New York City. I think we've been sliding into decay for so long in such a strange way in these big cities. I don't know. It just seems to me like it's just a return to the trend,
Yeah, but it's not happening everywhere.
Oh no. No. You go to fancy parts of cities in the US, and it is pristine, So I think personally, like a lot of places are just abandoned. I mean, they have been for a long time. I think that's sort of I was thinking about it. It's so inefficient, but it's just the way it is. You have these big cities and all these, like look at, I was north of Washington, D.C. in Baltimore, right? And it's completely abandoned, 3-story walk-up type places. Then I went a little south of D.C., down and about the same distance as Baltimore, and they're building attached condos right next to each other, essentially recreating the same city that was abandoned, an hour before. And I don't know why it is. I think like that's basically part of the U.S. model. It's just like creative destruction. Let one place just turn into absolute crap, and then just everybody builds somewhere else. It's insane, but I think it goes with
So looking from the outside, the United States has a number of problems too that have been, and some of them are really strange. But there's obviously a civil war happening in the political administration that's been going on since 2016. They're at war with themselves.
Yes.
Right. And so that's having a devastating effects on the outcome of everything else.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole thing's a turkey shoot.
Yeah, I basically have had my life threatened and things. When I was running for office this last fall, I had my life threatened on, a couple times, and you can't count on any. I mean, it's just, it is kind of I lived in Central America in the early 80s, and there are some parallels. Like you really, it's starting to get like that a little bit. I mean, not, Maine is pretty good, but I'll tell you, there's places that are just big trouble.
Yeah, I was looking at Chicago in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so there are multiple places around the world have got a whole lot of troubles. What's fascinating to watch, the United States food system was hit. Now, I don't know what the true number is now, but when I saw this a couple of months ago, there was a list of 96 separate incidents where some part of the food system would have something random happen to it. Like there was like 18,000 pigs or hogs that were kept in a process factory. The factory burned down. The pigs didn't get out. They all died. And no one can explain what happened. Right, and that's that sort of thing. Like another food processing plant was shut down because an aeroplane crashed into it. You think, what?
Yeah.
And so we are a multiple sigma event in terms of an actuary calculation of events. And what I think is happening is the United States is actually in unconventional war with someone. It's just not been declared.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and we're seeing the population being softened up.
So a multiple sigma event, is that a low probability event?
Yeah, so if you've got, like, say, a standard deviation, and you've got the average, and you've got the average, and you've got standard deviation, that's one sigma. So if you've got a multiple sigma event, you've got an event that's got a probability that's multiple standard deviations away from that mean. And someone did an actuary calculation. I think we're at a 14 sigma, 14 standard deviations away from the average probability of this actually happening, which means it's not like a random thing.
No.
It means it's a synthetic event. It's like later, I think it will come out that the United States has actually been in an unconventional war that was never declared.
Yes. Well, there were people in North Carolina, South Carolina, and they were knocking out power stations also. Did you hear about that?
Oh, there's lots of stuff. So power stations, infrastructure.
Yeah, infrastructure.
Come on, guys.
Well, it's like living in a place during wartime. I mean, I visited El Salvador in the middle of the Troubles, and I went to the tourist office, and they said, you should go visit these places. I said, well, they've blown up the bridges, and they've, there is no way you could get to that. They said, well, yeah, but you can get there. You had to go into rebel-controlled territory and stuff. So it's weird because there is kind of like a whole structure that works during wartime. It does continue. There is, and people will tell you things work and things. There were still people sitting there in that tourist office giving me maps and different things. And so, and then you just realize, like, this whole place, 2/3 of the country was rebel controlled, etc. So you just realize, like, the whole place is, it's a crazy thing, but life during wartime. Remember that Talking Heads song? We're in it.
So I live in Finland. I'm in Helsinki at the moment, and Helsinki is a very structured society. There's a very, very high trust between the people and their government.
Yeah.
The police are respected. People are law-abiding. Corporations proudly pay their tax. They line up in the street to pay their tax. Thank you very much. Right, and so they prize honesty. Right, so I'm in this society, and everything around me works and flows as it should. And then I start, but then I sort of see what's happening in the United States and Australia. God damn! Like everywhere across the Anglosphere, our governments and authorities have collectively lost their mind.
Yeah.
Right, and
they call him ScoMo, right?
Not anymore. There's a new guy now.
The new guy. Okay.
But so Australia has the same problem as the United States. You've got a two-party option. You've got a third party with the Greens, but really there's two, because they merge into two groups. And there's no discernible difference between either party, right? But for a long time now, it seems like this. Most industrial assets and most natural resources in Australia are now bought and owned by foreign investment. They're no longer Australian. We've lost control of our own sovereignty. We are responsible for the mess, but we are not allowed to partake in the profits. So the governments of Australia, for the last, I don't know how long, but let's say 20 years, have been operating on the premise to facilitate the asset stripping of the continent by foreign investment, and to facilitate all that before things really, really turn ugly. And so a lot of the decisions being made have not been made on behalf of the people on the ground, and there's been scandal after scandal after scandal. And so as they change the administration from one group to the other, it never changes. The same basic problem sits in the background, while there's a different group shouting, rearrange those deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah.
So why are they facilitating the stripping of Australia while we still can? Like, are they getting paid, bribed,
No,
or is
not really.
something else
I
happening?
don't know. I don't know that, but I'm working on the principle that, like, in all industrial systems are global in nature. Money is global in nature. It sits in tax hedge funds. It sits in tax havens. Sorry, money moves around the world. Like, so much like the richest 67 people in the world own as much as the bottom 50%, or something silly like that.